Assalamu alaikum. Today we are joined by Sister Yasmin Mogahed, who's here all the way from the USA, and I've got Fay co-hosting with me as well.
Hello.
Welcome to the Y-Factor, Sister Yasmin.
Thank you. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We had just asked what you've found of Australia so far. You've been fortunate enough to visit both Sydney and Melbourne, and we won't dwell on the rivalry too long, but we understand you've seen some great sights so far.
Yes, alhamdulillah. I got to visit the Blue Mountains near Sydney, and in Melbourne I had a really nice view of the skyline downtown, and so I really loved that. And the community has been amazing, very, very welcoming, alhamdulillah. So I really enjoyed both cities.
Okay, well, we've got a mixed bunch of questions today that have been submitted from all of our listeners, and one of the first things we might do is, just for those who don't have a general idea about your background, firstly, you do have a degree in psychology, you also have a master's in journalism, and you write for the Huffington Post as well as a variety of other places. But credentials aside, who is Yasmin Mogahed?
I think that when I talk about who I am sort of at a personal level, one of the things that I like to do is really humanize the whole idea of a teacher. Sometimes I think that the people who stand up on podiums and give lectures are not necessarily always very humanized, and so we think of them as just icons or symbols of certain maybe ideals or something. They represent something to us, and I try to really move away from that, because to me the most important thing of really connecting to another person is humanizing that person. And so you don't see that person as just a symbol or an icon, but as a complete human being who has weaknesses, who has a personality, who has, likes and dislikes. So for me personally, even the way I maintain like my Facebook page and different things that I post, I try to keep it real, in terms of who I am. And if I'm struggling with something, I usually write about it and I post about it in some sense, or I reflect about it, and I sort of post reflections that come out of that struggle, I think. But one of the pieces in my book, the very first piece, Why Do People Have to Leave Each Other, really gets into, it's probably the most personal piece I've written. It gets into my own temperament ever since I was a child, and how that temperament has affected my path to God, and what I learned through that about Allah and about the creation.
So sort of a mix about your personality and then your spiritual journey through that.
Yes, absolutely. The mix of my temperament being very sensitive ever since I was very young, and I would get very attached to people, and how that affected my journey to God, yes.
One thing our listeners have asked about is your background in the study of Islamic sciences. Would you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, I think that, around the time I was 13 or 14, growing up, we always learned, I came from a practicing Muslim family. I was born and raised Muslim. I never went to a full-time Islamic institution. Even in my schooling, I went to public schools. I was where we would learn about Islam on the weekends and, at home and this and that, but it wasn't full-time. And then, by around the time, before I entered into high school, around the time I was 14, I started to take a more more serious approach about learning and trying to develop my Islamic identity. So there was a lot of, self-study as well as study with various teachers since then.
Yeah. So is it a bit of a halaqah kind of environment, or it wasn't like a formal education?
Yes, it was a mix. Well, it was a mix of individual teachers and self-study for many years since I was 14. More focused. Although obviously since I was young, my parents and my teachers taught me. But I think there was sort of a change that happened where I started to focus more on my Islamic identity around that time, and that's also when I started to wear hijab.
Oh, okay, right. Okay, now this question is a little bit of a totally different tangent.
Okay.
What is the most popular question or theme that you're asked about?
Love and relationships.
Okay, that is actually one of the most popular questions on our show. So,
when I was in Malaysia, I was doing a show or an interview with TV Al Hijra. They have Islamic television there,
right.
And they were like referring to me as the love doctor or something like that. It was really bizarre, but I think that's pretty much the most common theme.
Well, do you ever worry, though, that with quotes you put out there to do with that particular topic, I don't know, that you're seen in a particular view, you know, as the love doctor, for example? Do you
As
feel
a
like
love
it's a little bit
doctor?
skewed?
You know, I honestly, I just try to be, I try to be true to myself and true to my, my thoughts and my beliefs. And it is something that I personally find a fascination with, and I personally find an interest in learning about, and therefore it's going to be reflected in my teachings as well, and in what I share. So it's a reflection of my own interests and my own journey, and that's pretty much what I write about. You know, and I think that's what we need to do. Is we have lost the importance of specializing.
Yeah.
Not everyone needs to be. You know, speak about every single topic, but I think it's important that we try to, instead of breadth, I think it's important that we try to have and seek depth. So that's kind of what I try to do, is look into a particular subject and try to you know, go a little bit deeper in it. So that's kind of my own personal interest as well.
So Miran and I were fortunate enough to hear you speak today. And one thing you spoke about, and I guess a focus that I really picked up on, was Western feminism today, and this misconception that Muslim women need Western feminism to liberate them. Do you believe there is a place for Islamic feminism, or, you know, is there such a thing as Islamic feminism?
That's a good question, and I think that even the term itself seems to apply, rather, the term itself seems to imply that there isn't enough women's rights in Islam, that we need to add a modifier, feminism. And that's not true. That if we follow the example of the Prophet ﷺ, if we follow the Quran and we follow the Sunnah, we will have already the greatest system for the liberation of women and ensuring the rights of women. We don't need to add the modifier feminist or feminism. And so I don't actually like that terminology. It's kind of like we say that the term moderate Muslim doesn't make any sense, because Islam is already moderate. So all I have to say is I'm Muslim, and that already implies that that already includes the moderation. I don't need to say moderate Muslim.
It's inherent.
It's already inherent in Islam is moderation. Similarly, women's rights and women's liberation is already inherent in Islam. Therefore, I don't need to say I'm a Muslim feminist. I'm just Muslim, and if I follow, you know, what's already there, I will be liberating women, and I will have those rights. The problem really comes that we don't follow the religion; we follow our culture, and it's the culture that oppresses women. And I don't just mean Eastern culture. Sometimes we think, oh, it's over there, you know, in the East, that in the Muslim world or wherever, that women are oppressed. Yes, there's definitely oppression in the East. However, there's also oppression in the West, and it may take a different form. But to objectify a woman and to sexualize her and to make her into an object, that's oppression. And we just haven't, you know, women have not been liberated from that type of oppression in the West. And on the other hand, there's definitely as well, there's a different type of oppression perhaps in the East.
Yeah, it's a bit ironic. It's kind of like to do with the semantics. It's just different wordings and labeling of the same issues, really, in different contexts. Well, on the topic of another ism, but also to do with culture, how do you deal with the sexism that's sometimes displayed towards female Muslim speakers in the Muslim communities?
We have to deal with it with a lot of patience. It is frustrating. However, I think that it may be a vocal, but you know, they may be vocal, this sector of society or of the community, but I believe that they are a minority, and it is a minority opinion. And sometimes, unfortunately, the people who have the loudest voice get the most attention, but even if they're a minority. And sometimes, see, there's a thing about extremes, going to any extreme or another, is it doesn't last, it's not stable, and people come and go who are extreme. But what will remain is moderation. And so what we've found is there have been many trends in the past of extremes that have come and gone. And I think that this is one of them. And inshallah, we're moving in the right direction. We're, you know, coming back to middle and coming back to the authentic tradition. Because in fact, when you study the tradition of female scholarship, you find that it's a very rich tradition. And women were teachers of great scholars, such as Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, and so
Or even going back to Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha, she was quite a big scholar herself.
Yes, indeed, indeed. And you know, sometimes we do mention you know, the mothers of the believers, but we think, oh, well, that was so long ago. But there's a rich history, and there's a rich tradition after her as well, of teachers, of scholars who were women, who were teachers of some great male scholars as well. Okay. But we've lost, I think, touch with that tradition, and instead we are very much in some places pulled by culture rather than you know, that tradition itself.
I mean, we've just spoken about, or used phrases like extreme and what a moderate Muslim really means. Do you believe, and this phrase is thrown around quite often in the media these days, there's a radical or extremist Muslim issue in modern Islam? To what extent, and if so, you do see that problem, what do you see as the solution?
I think that it's actually very dishonest to say, to basically look at the issue of so-called radicalization and extremism and blame it on Islam or blame it on the religion. And the reason is that when studies have been done, for example, the recent Gallup poll of the Muslim world, the biggest poll of its kind, when it asked those who had radical views why they had those radical views, they were giving, the reasons that they gave had nothing to do with religion. It wasn't because those people are Christian or because those people are not Muslim, but rather they were all political grievances. Because those people are fighting unjustly our people in Palestine and Afghanistan, and so even those who are extreme or radicalized, the reason that they're angry, the reason that they are radicalized is because of the political, the foreign policy, the political grievances that they have. And so it has nothing to do with Islam itself. It's because these people, you know, they're angry about the foreign policy in the Muslim world, in countries like Palestine and Afghanistan and Iraq. So it is very, very dishonest to paint it to be a religious issue. It isn't a religious issue. Even those themselves who speak from that point of view, of radicalized point of view, they themselves say that it's a political issue and not a religious issue.
Well, I mean, a lot of the times people seem to think that it's because of things that happen in the Arab world, or at least a lot of commentators seem to imply that. So if we were to take a step back from that a moment and say, what are the biggest issues that you think are really facing the Arab world at the moment? What would you nominate?
You know, honestly, when I look at the political climate, I tend to look at it from a spiritual lens. You know, I really take it back to when the Prophet ﷺ said, you know, more than 1400 years ago, that there will come a time when his ummah will be like the froth on the ocean. And he explains that the ummah will become so weak and that the enemies will come and gather one another to feast on them, like somebody gathers someone to feast on food. Yeah. And then the companion said, is it going to be because we are small in number? And he said, no, it will be because that Allah, what will happen is the fear that was once in the hearts of your enemies will be taken out, and in your hearts, in the hearts of the ummah, will be put wahan. And when he explained what is wahan, he said, hubb ad-dunya wa karahiyat al-maut, the love of dunya and the hatred of death. So from this hadith, we learn, we diagnose the reason why the ummah is in the state that it is today. We can look at all the political reasons, we can look at all the external reasons, but we really, the heart of it, at the core of it, it is because of our spiritual disease. We internally, our hearts need to be changed. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ, that Allah never changes the condition of a people until they change what's inside themselves. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not give us that victory and that change of our circumstance until we start to change inside. We need to stop being dishonest. We need to stop, you know, cheating. We need to stop having this low moral character. We need to start changing ourselves and our interaction with one another, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will change our condition.
Do you think we've reached a point where we've become excuse makers, to use that phrase, where I know there are many external political influences, and it's not right to essentially minimise those issues, but do you think we're focusing, from what you've said, too much on what's happening to the Arab world as opposed to really fixing the issues within our own community?
And just even, sorry to follow up on Fay's question there, like if we could link that back to the issue with the Boston bombings, which didn't even, I mean, the suspects are not even Arab in the end, and yet the community response from what we've seen on Twitter and on Facebook from American Muslim leaders has been sort of to distance themselves or to defend that they preach only a moderate Islam, which goes back to what you were mentioning in your earlier question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in terms of excuses, I think that yes, I do believe that we have the wrong focus. I think that when you focus on the problem externally without looking at the problems we have internally, then we have missed the point. We've missed the actual core issue. Yes, we have a lot of problems externally, and no one is going to say that you turn and you pretend that they don't exist, but we have to start focusing on how really to solve those problems at a root level. I don't think that we have focused enough on that. And so long as we continue to have these diseases inside of us, carry these diseases and continue to have societies that are diseased, you know, that full of corruption, full of dishonesty, you know, that our character is you know, our character has just become decayed. And so long as that continues to be the case, our condition will never change. We have to really come back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we have to start purifying ourselves inside, and as well as, of course, working externally. But this is how the help of Allah comes. The help of Allah comes when we come back to Him. But we will never ever be successful, and we will never get the help of Allah so long as we aren't changing inside, so long as we are not coming back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala individually and collectively.
And in relation to the Boston bombings and the reaction of the Muslim community, just as an American Muslim yourself and as an international speaker, I mean, how would you respond to being questioned about it?
Well, I mean, I think it is important for Muslims to clarify that the actions of individuals do not represent the religion, do not represent, of course, the community at large. This is a fact. The thing that bothers me is that we need to make that clarification. The reason that bothers me is if the suspect is a Christian groups don't have to make that clarification. It is assumed. Mm-hmm. It is assumed that just because he's Christian doesn't mean all Christians believe that you should bomb things.
And that was evidenced with the school massacre and the Aurora killings as well.
Exactly. When a white person goes into a theater and kills people, or goes into a school and kills children, you don't see media outlets go and talk to Christian groups and ask them, so what do you think about it, or do you support this, or does your religion say this is okay? It's not even asked. I mean, that's even a ridiculous idea. No Christian groups stood up and said, our Bible doesn't teach that you can go and shoot children in schools, because it's a ludicrous connection. However, if the person happens to be a Muslim, then all of a sudden the entire religion goes on trial. It isn't a criminal anymore, but he becomes a Muslim terrorist or a Muslim extremist, and Muslim is the emphasis there.
Yeah, and there's like a global witch hunt of all Muslims, yes, or the religion itself, yes, rather than focus on the act.
In fact, a few years ago, I wrote an article for the Huffington Post about, at that time, there was a case of a terrorist group, who are a Christian terrorist group, called the Houthi militia, or they were actually planning to take over. I think it was they were going to take over either some police or government even, and they had all these plans, and they got. Their plans got foiled before they could actually carry them out. But it was very interesting to look at the way in which the media covered the issue. This was a Christian group who not just were, sort of just Christian on the side, but in fact their website was quoting verses from the Bible. So they were feeling like this had to do with their religion, and yet there was no type of questioning of all Christian groups. You know, Christians weren't all of a sudden profiled at the airport.
Yeah.
You know, that didn't happen. But unfortunately, that's the case with Muslims.
Unfortunately. Well, look, just to sort of put a bit more of a happy glow to the ending of the interview, we're going to switch this more to your, apparently what the Malaysians call your love doctor focus. We have a question that is related to marriage. Fay?
Why do you think there's a high divorce rate presently? And do young modern couples have a threshold for handling the problems of everyday life? And if so, what advice would you give to them?
That's a really, really big question. And I think that it is not a simple answer. I think there are a lot of issues. And one of the, a number of issues. One of the issues is that I don't also think it's completely accurate to say, sometimes I think we are also not completely honest in that looking at, okay, the divorce rate now is this percentage, whereas, with our parents it was this percent, because that doesn't necessarily say much, because a lot of times the older generation, they were just as miserable, but they just stayed together. So that doesn't necessarily, to me, doesn't look like success. Just because, you sleep in separate rooms, but you didn't officially get divorced, that's not success either. So I think it's important to also understand that we're not comparing apples and apples. The difference now is that when you're miserable, you have the option of getting divorced, whereas in the past, you just stayed together for the sake of the children. So that's one difference. But another thing is, I think that there's a major problem in terms of two things. One, expectations of what you're supposed to get from marriage, and that's huge. And I think actually it's interesting because it's very much related to the piece I just read from my book called This Is Love. And it's this idea that marriage is kind of the ending instead of the path. If you think it's the ending, as soon as you get married, now you expect, okay, now it's Jannah, now it's happily ever after, now everything's supposed to be easy, now all my problems are supposed to be fixed, now all my emptiness is supposed to be filled.
The fairy tale.
Yes, absolutely. Now I never was happy before in my life, but all of a sudden I'm going to be happy. All these kinds of myths, and that's completely, those are poisonous types of expectations, because obviously they're not true, and then people become very disappointed. That's one issue. The other issue is just that there isn't enough preparation, there isn't enough training. Men and women really are so fundamentally different. They think different, they communicate different, they deal with problems differently, and there needs to be training. This whole idea of counseling, only going to counseling if you go at all, already after when you're basically on your way to the courthouse to get divorced, you stop at the counselor.
Yeah.
That's not going to really work out. You need to have the counseling before you get married, even premarital counseling, so that you actually learn the skills to be able to be successful. You can't enter, when you go to China, you're not going to go to China without learning the language to communicate. And yet we enter into these relationships and we completely don't understand the language and we don't know how to communicate with one another. And it creates a lot of problems, but these problems are avoidable and they're fixable. But the issue is that we don't have the training, and then we also we wait very long before seeking help. So, there's that stigma still about seeking counseling and that kind of thing. So I think all those types of keeping all those things in mind, expectations as well as training, is huge. And then finally, we need to really be very careful in terms of where we are seeking our ultimate fulfillment. This is something I speak about a lot, because if a person is empty inside, if a person is not filled with their relationship with God, then they're going to seek that fill from people. And or money or other things in their life. And if you go into your marriage empty, you're going to have a lot of problems. And so really one of the solutions at a spiritual level is to work on your relationship with God, so that when you enter into a relationship, you're already full inside. You're not expecting someone to fill you or complete you, but you're actually going into that relationship to complement and join. Not because you're incomplete, but rather that the two people come together and they can enable one another, help one another in that path back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
And we're going to just wrap this up with hopefully a very positive note, inshallah. What inspires Yasmin Mogahed?
What inspires Yasmin? I would say that so much of what I share, so much of what I write about and teach is just really what I've learned in my own personal path to back to Allah. It's the same path everybody is on. We're all returning. We all started at Allah and we're returning to Allah. and we need Allah along the way. And I really have I feel that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taken me through life and taught me a lot of things, and I hope to share those things with other people, and that's kind of what I'm doing. And so I'm still going, and I think every moment that we live, we're struggling towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but finally we meet Him, inshallah. And one of my favorite ayats, and it's just so comforting, is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhal insanu innaka kadihun ila rabbika kadahan famulaqi. So Allah here is saying, oh mankind, indeed you are toiling, ever painfully toiling towards your Lord, but you shall meet Him.
And on that beautiful note, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep us all steadfast on His path, inshallah. And thank you, Jazakallah khairan, for joining us today, Yasmin.
Thank you.
And we hope you have a safe trip back to America.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.